Putin has put on his military uniform again. Is he preparing for peace talks?
The General Staff needs to think about supplying the troops for the coming winter period.
Kadyrov's TikTok troops versus the good drones. The result is obvious. Crimea is on fire. The Shahed launch site was blown to pieces.
It was this particular site that Russia used to stockpile, meticulously prepare, and subsequently launch Iranian-made Shaheds at Ukraine's vital civilian infrastructure and urban areas.
War is at Turkey's doorstep. Erdogan is in a panic.
The war between Russia and Ukraine has clearly begun to threaten navigational safety in the Black Sea.
Putin was told a fairy tale about the capture of Pokrovsk and Volchansk.
Undoubtedly, Russia has several offensive actions and operations. None of these operations have been successful.
Russian Shaheds are moving to a new level, a new threat for Ukraine.
Shaheds can now launch missiles. Today, for the first time, Russia used a drone equipped with an R-60 air-to-air guided missile. Now, more on this and other topics. Hello, you are on the YouTube channel Ukraine Today. In the studio with you is Volodymyr Rabchun. Subscribe to our channel and like this video. It's easy and simple for you and it makes us happy. YouTube's algorithms really like it and it helps promote our content. Thank you. And now let's move on to our topics. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has denied the Russians' claims about the capture of Vovchansk, Kupiansk and Pokrovsk. Defense force units continue defensive operations in difficult areas of the front, while the enemy often records so-called flag-planting videos to create the appearance of successful offensive operations. At the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces are clearing settlements in the Dnipropetrovsk region of occupiers. More details about what is happening at the front are in our military review.
Drones in Kaspiysk, Dagestan.
Strikes on the Caspian, it's a distance of over 1,000 kilometers to Kaspiysk, are routine actions by the Ukrainian defense forces and accordingly the Ukrainian intelligence community.
There are a number of military facilities of the occupying country in Kaspiysk, as well as oil refining enterprises. Accordingly, they could have been the target of the strike. In this footage, Ukrainian drone operators on the border are eliminating legitimate targets. As a result, in the southern Slobozansky direction, 2 enemy vehicles, communication systems, and 5 occupiers were destroyed. And here, soldiers of the 57th Brigade are destroying waiting drones whose plan was to disrupt Ukrainian logistics. Another small victory for the Ukrainian armed forces is the clearing of the village of Ivanivka from occupiers in the Dnipropetrovsk region. On the deep state map, you can see that on November 28th, Ivanivka was marked as a gray zone, and on the 29th, it was already designated as liberated territory. The situation remains more complicated in the Pokrovsk direction. In Mirnorad, the Russian army is not giving up attempts to encircle the Ukrainians.
Regarding Mirnorad, the situation is difficult. Fighting is taking place directly in Mirnorad itself, specifically on the outskirts. The occupiers are trying by using small assault groups to infiltrate directly into the urban area and create conditions to establish themselves and amass both manpower and, accordingly, strike assets. Ukraine's defense forces are successfully conducting strike and search operations aimed at destroying the enemy's small assault groups.
The US is demanding a complete withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces. From Donbass, journalists report, the Ukrainian side is opposed and is demanding a meeting between Zelensky and Trump.
Apparently, at this particular point in time, the ongoing negotiations have not yet reached a definitive conclusion. On the other hand, it should also be emphasized that Witkoff has already flown to Moscow for talks with the Russian dictator.
Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports that NATO is preparing for a potential conflict with Russia with minimal support from the US.
At the moment, it is precisely under pressure from the United States that the process of actual modernization of the military-industrial complex of European NATO countries is taking place, and accordingly, processes related to the re-equipment of European partners with the latest strike and active defense systems.
The Ukrainians can also boast about the modernization of their weaponry. Our country is developing weapons against Russian glide bombs, KABs, and can already report their successful use and the destruction of the first 100 enemy aerial bombs.
It was precisely the mass use of KABs that allowed the Russian Federation to achieve certain tactical successes directly on the front line of contact. We're talking about the fact that on certain sections of the front, the aviation of the occupying country The Russian Federation's aerospace forces strike the positions of Ukraine's defense forces using up to 300 KABs per day. In response to these challenges, the Ukrainian side has developed a system to counter KABs. This is a joint development with NATO countries, which will include several components: ground-based, airborne, and accordingly electronic warfare systems.
The development of new defense systems is vital for Ukrainians under constant shelling by Russia. At this moment, every resident of Ukraine is under threat, even the weapons developers themselves. During the strike on Vyshhorod in the Kyiv region, an employee of the defense company Firepoint, which is developing the Flamingo missile, was killed in his own home. With an Iskander-M ballistic missile strike, Russia has taken the lives and health of peaceful residents of Dnipro, who will no longer go to work, return home, or visit friends because the Kremlin has robbed them of that possibility.
Serhiy Bratchuk, spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, is joining our broadcast. Serhiy Borisovich, glad to welcome you.
Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the defense forces. Greetings.
Glory to the heroes. Serhiy Borisovich, in your opinion, what is the point of these flag plantings or flag planting actions? What is the purpose of this, and how, well, and for what, yes, is this image being created? This image of supposedly successful advances by Russian occupation forces deep into Ukrainian territory, if in reality, de facto, this is not happening?
You know, if before we used to talk more about these moments of victory mania on the battlefield, moments that don't actually exist, especially not at the operational, tactical, or strategic level, they were intended for the domestic Russian audience, which will swallow any information served up to them, so to speak, or have the wool pulled over their eyes. Today, I think that such moments are, among other things, or even primarily, strangely enough, intended for Ukrainian society. Because we all see it perfectly well. We all understand what's going on. And our civilian citizens can clearly see that the enemy is attacking, the enemy is advancing. And unfortunately, the Russians do have some tactical gains today. Yes, these are purely tactical in nature, but for civilians, any enemy advance always stirs up emotions. And those emotions are far from positive. That's why Russia keeps trying to create these emotional roller coasters for Ukrainians. Of course, these are also signals, including for Washington, as if to say, look, the Russian army is advancing, and what Mr. Trump and certain members of your team are presenting to you does correspond to reality. Supposedly Russia is winning, and accordingly, I think these are also signals for Beijing, which understands perfectly well, sees everything clearly. But such actions, which again provoke certain emotions, can be used to demonstrate that Russia is actually achieving something on the battlefield. And China, which today speaks about the integrity of Ukraine, our territorial independence, and the preservation of the Ukrainian state, nevertheless, as strange and paradoxical as it may sound, does not want the Russian Federation to win, but at the same time does not want Russia to lose either. Obviously, because Russia, as we have been saying for a long time, is turning into, or rather has already turned into, a raw materials appendage of the People's Republic of China. Accordingly, this is a Chinese proxy mechanism that can, among other things, now fight on the fields of Ukraine, in Ukrainian airspace, and in our Black Sea against the United States and Europe. So it's obvious that, and in fact, Putin, the report mentioned that there are fairy tales for Putin, and indeed we understand perfectly well that both Gerasimov, who calls himself the chief of the general staff of the Russian Federation, and at least one of the Putins who wears a military uniform live in a different reality. For them, Komsomolsk is Pokrovsk, which isn't actually untrue. For them, Kupiansk is our Kupiansk, which obviously the Russians have occupied. And this isn't the first time, right? Just over the course of a few weeks. And so we mentioned there Mirnograd, Liman, Yampol. For them, the geography of Ukraine today has turned into a map of certain strategic battles from World War II. It's that whole our grandfathers fought narrative. So all these signals accordingly are being transmitted. The Russian leadership accordingly has great faith in them and believes that the intelligence services of the world are now lagging behind the Russian FSB, formerly the KGB, which once demonstrated its power all over the world. But today, with modern technical intelligence tools, intelligence agencies around the world, even the Estonian intelligence service often comments on things. So obviously, and I say this without irony, so obviously today everyone can clearly see what is happening on the battlefield. And everyone understands perfectly well what allows Russia to still have an advantage in certain areas of the front. It's cannon fodder, in other words, a large number of infantry, and accordingly the aviation component. If these factors that give Russia an advantage on the battlefield are neutralized, and there are tools to do so, then it is obvious that the collapse of the Russian Federation, both economically and in military political terms, is not just inevitable, Russia is moving toward it.
For Russia, the image is clearly very important. That's why this appearance of successful advances and so on is being created. Flag planting ceremonies, Putin, one of the Putins, in military uniform before visiting Witkoff. So in that case, what effect do other images create? Well, for example, a strike on the Kadyrovites' base in Gudermis or an exploding Sarmat missile. If you listen to Putin, it's like hell in a metal shell, but if you actually look at the missile, it still can't be successfully tested.
You know, maybe it wasn't the Sarmat that exploded. Maybe it was Oreshnik that shot down the Sarmat. And these were the kinds of studies conducted at that test site. Accordingly, we're talking about the fact that you can threaten the world, you can be armed with nuclear weapons, but today, when it comes to nuclear weapons from the Russian Federation, the world is actually concerned about something completely different, how well this nuclear arsenal is guarded and stored. Today, everyone perfectly understands where Putin's bluff lies, what his so-called mythical strength is. However, you mentioned one of the names, Mr. Witkoff, for whom quite possibly these flag planting events were carried out. I think that today, over a friendly dinner, we are talking with you precisely about this. At that moment when, apparently, he had already had dinner with Mr. Dmitriev and the representative of Putin in negotiations, or rather communications with Washington, but quite possibly he is now dining with Mr. Putin himself, who calls himself the President of the Russian Federation. So, accordingly, I think they are quite likely showing him just such a movie there. At the same time, they show Ukrainian soldiers, right? Who, how did Putin call us again? I won't even repeat that word. All right, I'll say it in Ukrainian. It's a bit more pleasant that way, isn't it? Beskachinki. Well, first of all, we're at home, so we definitely can't be homeless, right? Then our equipment and accordingly everything necessary for combat is at least as good as the Russians, to put it mildly. And in many respects, it's even better. So it's obvious that this image, in fact, is needed. And actually, once again, the military might of the Russian Federation, look, it has turned into just an image. In fact, I'm not saying that they don't have combat units. They do have combat units and regular troops that fight and are capable of waging war. But that only raises the value of our Ukrainian actions, the assessment of the Ukrainian defense forces who are fighting such a well-prepared enemy who, despite all the claims about being the second army in the world, truly represent a great force. Today, Ukraine, despite tactical withdrawals, which unfortunately we have to acknowledge as reality, though not on all parts of the front, demonstrates we can strike the enemy. And accordingly, you know, today, one of the Putins said that the so-called special military operation is not a war because it's supposedly some kind of surgical intervention, surgical work on the battlefield. Well, actually, I suppose I can confirm that. It's just that this so-called surgical work in reality is called Rusores, Russian cutter.
Okay. Gudermis. Rusores, Gudermis, we're almost making it into a slogan.
So actually in Gudermis, yes, and at that base where it hit, where the strike happened, you know, these aren't just strikes against Kadyrov's men, although in the Caucasus in particular, Kadyrov talks a lot about blood feuds, right? Let me remind the Russians watching us, it was Kadyrov himself, back then still a very young Ramzan, who was beheading Russian soldiers. Well, don't forget about that. Aren't you ashamed of yourselves, gentlemen who are not officers, gentlemen who are not soldiers? So actually, this is probably not our revenge, but divine retribution for how Kadyrov behaved towards our prisoners. What has Kadyrov said, and what does he continue to say about Ukrainians? How much does he threaten us? Well, as you can see, divine retribution reaches even Gudermes and Akhkoy Martan. Accordingly, even the FSB base was hit there. Well, let's once again make sure that the Ukrainian reach is so long that it extends all the way to the Caucasus and can slap the one who, let me remind Russians once again, was beheading Russian soldiers. Don't forget about this. If necessary, we will help detain Kadyrov and Ramzan and hand them over to the Russian people for a fair trial. But this was after the fall of Putin's regime.
Sergei Borisovich, in your opinion, could this weaken Kadyrov's position in Chechnya?
You know, first of all, we are not talking about Chechnya, we are talking about Ichkeria. Back in the days of the ATO, I had the chance to fight alongside our brothers in arms from Ichkeria. These people are still fighting today as part of the armed forces of Ukraine and other units, structural divisions of the defense forces. These people will definitely return to their homeland. Ukraine is also helping the peoples of the Caucasus in this regard. This is obvious today. Will this weaken Kadyrov's own position? I think his time will come to an end just like Putin's time will. For us, in any case, the departure from the political stage, whether due to physical death or political oblivion of either one or the other, is a pleasant bonus, because what matters most to us today is not just a change of faces at the Kremlin or, say, on the Grozny Olympus. What matters most to us today is that Russia, in the form in which it threatens not only Ukraine but all of Europe and the entire world, ceases to exist. That is the goal. And this goal should be pursued by all civilizations, by all free people in our world. And it's clear that Europeans are demonstrating this very clearly today. The Americans need to catch up. That's why Kadyrov's position, of course, will still be weakened, accordingly by such strikes as well. After all, what did these strikes show? Kadyrov, with his air defense systems, can shoot down, let me remind you, civilian Azerbaijani planes. Baku will still answer Russia for this terror. They will answer, I am sure of it. And actually, look at our Ukrainian combat mosquitoes. See how they fly right through Kadyrov's much vaunted air defense system. So we're right to say that Akhmat is not a force. Akhmat is just bag tea.
Yeah, it really does seem that way. Okay. The Russian dictator is signing the budget for the year 2026. A significant portion of it, still not the majority, meaning not more than half, but nevertheless 40%, if I'm not mistaken, is allocated to the security sector. Not just the military, but also those who will be carrying out repressions within the country. Plus, they are betting on the formation of new divisions and also reorganizing the troops. In your professional opinion, what is all this being done for? Is this, again, just creating an image? Or is it actually the case that maybe, well, they've drawn conclusions, learned from their mistakes, and now will try to achieve their goals with new forces, new tricks, and possibly a new strategy?
You know, Vladimir, we do not underestimate the enemy. Today, it is clear that the Russians' infiltration tactics have unfortunately brought them some successes, right? In some cases, we weren't always able to respond to it in time, right? And today, time has shown that something probably more radical needs to be done to counter this challenge. I'm not trying to lecture our commanders right now. They are the ones who can teach each of us a lot, both in life and in the military profession. However, it worked, didn't it? So what we're saying is that the Russians are learning during the war. They're inventing new things, including in tactics and technology. And in some areas, we're probably even catching up to them. We're confident that we'll catch up. I'm not talking about surpassing Russia, but we are responding appropriately to the challenges that exist today. And we understand perfectly well that, yes, of course, these so-called divisions, regiments, brigades, and blocking detachments, these are not just for show. These are the realities that Putin ultimately wants to bring the Russian Federation to in order to, well, put everyone under arms one way or another. After all, the legal framework in Russia today, thanks to Putin and his loyalists, the Federation Council, the State Duma of the Russian Federation, all of this has already been put in place. Will Putin go for a general mobilization? You know, when people ask this question, but in fact, it's already happening today, just in hidden forms. And Putin is not afraid to carry it out. Well, let's be honest. He will only be afraid when his actions pose a threat to his personal safety. That's when he'll be afraid. At that point, he'll use blocking detachments and those very same law enforcement agencies to intimidate the population. I don't believe in Russian uprisings or rebellions today. There in the national republics, some movement might start, but on the so-called Moscow lands themselves, hardly, at least for now. So this is also for show, and it's also meant to increase the number of Russian troops in Ukraine, among other things. Now the question is, how successful will this be? How successful will it be economically? How ready is Russia today to fight forever? Russia is not ready to fight forever, despite the paradoxical nature of some of Putin's actions. After all, today, when people say that Russia is ready to keep fighting, just look at some of the statements made by Russians. They actually suggest the opposite, that maybe it's time to stop. These signals are not directed at Ukraine, right? Not at President Zelensky. Well, strangely enough, they're afraid of Ukraine. Yes, that's probably what it sounds like. They're afraid of President Zelensky and really of the Americans. Let's just stop. Let's pause a little and talk about Ukraine without Ukraine being present, essentially. It's a stalling tactic. Today, it's clear that many statements are being made in exactly this way. That's why Russia and its resources are not unlimited. I'm not saying that the collapse of the Russian economy will happen today or tomorrow or the day after, but it truly isn't limitless, just as Russian soldiers are not immortal. Therefore, the process that Putin has set in motion, the destruction of the Russian Federation, today probably Well, I'm not making a prediction, but I'll try carefully, without exaggeration, to say that this process has entered its final stage.
So we'll keep watching how events unfold. Sergei Borisovich, thank you very much.
Thank you as well, together with you.
The Ukrainian Volunteer Army joined our broadcast. Thank you.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.